The lonely aftermath of treason. Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back into a quieter corner of history. The kind where the execution is already over. The crowds have gone home, and what's left behind isn't a head on a spike, but a widow trying to figure out what to do next. So, dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe make some tea. Because tonight, we're not talking about the traitors themselves. We're talking about the wives they left behind. The forgotten women of political disaster. The ones who didn't swing a sword or plot a coup, but still lost everything when their husbands' ambitions went up in flames. Let's start with a little context. In most of medieval and early modern Europe, treason wasn't just a crime against the crown. It was a full-blown social contagion. The logic went something like this. If one person in your family was a traitor, the rest of you were probably tainted too. Because, of course, loyalty was believed to run in the bloodline, and disloyalty naturally did too. So when a man was convicted of treason, his punishment didn't end with him. His lands were confiscated, his titles stripped, and his coat of arms, that proud little family logo, was basically set on fire. That meant his wife went from being lady something of somewhere to that unfortunate woman whose husband lost his head. Overnight, she could lose her home, her wealth, and her social status. And if she was unlucky enough to have children, they'd grow up marked as the offspring of a traitor, which, as you can imagine, didn't do wonders for their marriage prospects. Let's float over to one of the most famous cases, Anne Boleyn. You knew we were going to get there eventually. Now, Anne technically wasn't the wife of a man executed for treason. She was the one executed for treason herself. But her story sets the tone perfectly, because when she went down, so did a whole web of women around her. When Henry VIII decided that Anne was no longer the love of his life, or more accurately, no longer useful as a baby boy machine, he had her accused of adultery, witchcraft, and treason. Because why not throw in a few extra charges while you're at it? Her alleged lovers, including her own brother, were all executed. And their wives? They were left in this strange social purgatory. Margaret Wyatt, Lady Lee for example, one of Anne's closest friends, found herself quietly retreating from court, trying not to draw attention to the fact that she'd been part of the Queen's inner circle. Meanwhile, the families of Anne's supposed lovers were ruined. Their widows didn't get pensions or sympathy. They got silence. In Tudor England, being related to an executed man meant you were lucky just to not be imprisoned yourself. But Anne's wasn't the only high-profile implosion. Let's move forward a few decades to another of Henry's wives, Catherine Howard. She was accused of adultery, of course, because apparently Henry never got tired of the treasonous wife storyline. It was his favorite genre. When Catherine went down, her female relatives paid the price too. Her grandmother, the formidable Agnes Tilney, Duchess of Norfolk, was thrown into the Tower. Her cousin, Lady Rochford, the widow of Anne Boleyn's executed brother George, was also executed alongside her. So, in the Tudor era, being married to someone accused of treason was dangerous enough. But being related by marriage to a woman who had once been executed for treason? Even worse. Let's drift north now to Scotland. Land of mist, melancholy, and an absolute surplus of doomed nobles. The Scots had their own way of handling the wives of traitors. For instance, after the failure of the Jacobite rebellions in the 18th century, the British government cracked down hard. The men who'd backed the losing side, those romantic Highland lords with their tartans and tragic loyalties, were executed or exiled. And their wives? Well, most of them were left to pick up the ashes, quite literally. Take Lady Mackintosh, also known as Colonel Anne. She actually supported the Jacobite cause while her husband, hilariously, fought for the other side. When the rebellion collapsed, her husband kept his lands, and she was placed under house arrest. So apparently you could be punished just for having the wrong enthusiasm. Then there was Lady Nithsdale, who actually rescued her husband from execution by sneaking into his cell, disguised as a servant and dressing him up in women's clothes. Yes, she pulled off a full-blown escape and drag plan. And it worked. He fled to France, and she lived quietly in exile. A rare happy ending, though living quietly in exile is about as happy as it got in these stories. Now let's meander back to England for a classic example. Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen. Crowned at 17, deposed by 18, executed shortly after. And the fallout for her family was brutal. Her husband, Guilford Dudley, was executed too. And their mothers, Lady Frances Brandon, Jane's mother, and the Duchess of Northumberland, Guilford's, both had to navigate the wreckage. Frances, who'd once been a royal favorite, became a political ghost. Her daughter had just been executed for taking a crown that nobody really wanted her to have. Frances lost her influence, her position at court, and much of her wealth. She eventually remarried a man far below her rank. A scandalous move, but also a practical one. She was done with politics. The Duchess of Northumberland, meanwhile, had watched her entire family implode. Her husband and sons were dead, her family name disgraced. She spent the rest of her life quietly trying to get back a sliver of their confiscated estates. Because nothing says romantic tragedy quite like paperwork. Let's pause here for a moment and talk about what losing everything actually meant for these women. It's easy to imagine ruin as just losing your title or jewelry, but in practice, it was survival-level stuff. Without lands, they had no income. Without a husband, they had no legal standing. And without royal favor, they couldn't even petition for mercy. Because mercy, like everything else, was a business transaction. If you were lucky, you had a sympathetic friend at court who'd speak for you. Maybe even a monarch who was feeling generous that week. But if not, you'd be quietly erased. Now, if you were a foreign-born wife, things got even trickier. Imagine being a Spanish or French noblewoman who married into English politics. And then your husband got executed for treason. You couldn't go home easily because your homeland might see you as politically contaminated. But you couldn't stay because the English crown saw you as the widow of a traitor. Basically, you became an international liability with a widow's veil. One of the best examples is Catherine Pole, Baroness Montague. She was a granddaughter of the Duke of Clarence, one of the many Plantagenets unlucky enough to share blood with royalty. Her husband, Henry Pole, was executed by Henry VIII for supposed treason. Catherine herself was imprisoned for years. Her children were scattered, her estates were gone, and when she finally got out, she lived quietly in near poverty. So much for royal connections. Let's float over now to France, because French queens and mistresses had their own flair for catastrophe. In the 16th century, treason trials were often as much about style as substance. A man might be executed for opposing a royal marriage, or even just writing the wrong letter to the wrong person. Take Gabrielle d'Estrées, the mistress of King Henry IV of France. Now, she herself wasn't executed. She died mysteriously before that could happen. But several of her relatives were accused of conspiracy after her death. Their wives ended up in convents, which was the polite French way of saying, "We're confiscating your house, but here's a lifetime of prayer to make up for it." And convents, by the way, were the go-to solution for awkward widows. If a woman was too prominent to execute, but too inconvenient to leave free, the church offered a nice, quiet alternative. Imagine being locked in a drafty abbey with a dozen other women, none of whom could talk about politics, all waiting for the next royal scandal to drift down from Paris. A kind of medieval witness protection program, but with more incense. And then, there was Mary, Queen of Scots. Few women were so thoroughly defined by the men accused of treason around her. Her first husband, Lord Darnley, was murdered. Her second, the Earl of Bothwell, was accused of orchestrating that murder. She was accused of colluding with him. And her ladies-in-waiting? They became the collateral damage of royal gossip, interrogated, exiled, or quietly dismissed depending on who was winning the argument that week. It's easy to forget that treason didn't always mean trying to kill the king. Sometimes it just meant being on the wrong side of a rumor. By the time we reach the 17th century, the pattern is so well established that it's practically a ritual. A rebellion starts. Men get ambitious, heads roll, and their wives start writing letters to Parliament, begging not to starve. During the English Civil War, both royalist and parliamentarian wives faced ruin when their husbands were executed or exiled. Some of them, like Lady Fairfax, actually became political figures in their own right, writing pamphlets, managing estates, and negotiating ransoms. Others just waited. One of my favorite letters from that time, if favorite is the right word, comes from a widow begging for her confiscated bed linens back. Her husband had been executed, her estate seized, and she was living in a single rented room. She wrote very politely that she didn't mind losing her lands, but could she please have her sheets returned? History doesn't tell us if she got them. Probably not. Bureaucracy rarely moves fast when you're poor and female. Let's float one last time for tonight to the 18th century, when executions for treason were becoming less about swords and more about symbolism. The last great wave of traitors' widows came after the French Revolution. Imagine it. Paris. 1793, your husband was a nobleman. Maybe he'd voted the wrong way in the assembly. Maybe he'd said something snide about Robespierre. Maybe he just looked too clean. Next thing you know, he's gone. and you're sitting in an empty salon, waiting for someone to knock on your door with an arrest warrant. Thousands of women ended up widows of enemies of the people. Some were guillotined themselves. Others were left penniless, but many incredibly survived, reinventing themselves as seamstresses, teachers, or governesses. The revolution didn't just decapitate a generation of nobles. It turned their wives into the first wave of middle-class women.
Because when you lose everything, you either collapse or adapt.
And a surprising number of them adapted. So what happened to the wives of men executed for treason? They were erased, and then, quietly, they rebuilt. Some remarried into obscurity. Some went to convents. Some spent decades trying to reclaim the family estate from a crown that had long forgotten their names. And some, the rare few, took their husband's death and turned it into political capital. But most just survived. Slowly, silently. In a world that only remembered their husband's final words, never theirs. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake, impressive. You've survived Part 1's parade of royal tragedies and Tudor paperwork. Tonight, we'll float a little deeper into the lives of two women who refused to quietly disappear after their husband's downfall. Both lived centuries apart. Both were caught in the aftermath of treason. And both, somehow, managed to outwit the machinery of royal vengeance, in their own calm, clever way. So, let's start with a bit of drama, disguised as devotion. We're heading to the early 18th century, Scotland again. Because it seems like every good treason story comes with a side of tartan. Lady Winifred Maxwell, Countess of Nithsdale at 1716. The Jacobite rising has just collapsed, again. And the government in London is, to put it mildly, not amused. Anyone who fought for the pretender, James Stuart, the would-be heir to the English and Scottish thrones, was branded a traitor. Among them was William Maxwell, the 5th Earl of Nithsdale. He'd been captured at Preston and locked up in the Tower of London, sentenced to die for treason. Now, his wife, Lady Winifred, could have done what most noble women did in her position. Retreat to her estate, put on a black veil, and start writing very polite letters that would never be answered. But she didn't. Instead, she decided that if her husband was going to die, he'd at least have to make an effort to catch him first. Lady Winifred was a Catholic in a Protestant court, a Jacobite in Hanoverian London, and a woman in a world that didn't really expect women to do much beyond embroidery and disappointment. So she did what any self-respecting 18th century heroine would do. She staged a prison break. It's February, it's freezing, and London is buzzing with gossip about the upcoming executions. Winifred knows her husband is first in line. She's already tried petitioning the king, twice. Both times she was turned away. Politely, of course, because politeness makes rejection so much more elegant. So she turns to Plan B. Winifred disguises herself and sneaks into the tower with a few trusted servants. She brings with her a bundle of women's clothes, dresses, scarves, a hood, and a touch of courage. Inside, she meets with her husband one last time. Or so the guards think. But while they're distracted, she dresses him in one of the servants' gowns. He puts on the hood, the scarf, the veil. Then, pretending to be one of Winifred's attendants, he quietly walks out. She stays behind just long enough to chat with the guards. Small talk, keeping them calm, before slipping away herself. By the time anyone notices something's wrong, the Count of Nithsdale is already gone, galloping toward the coast. It's one of the most successful prison escapes in British history. And it was done without weapons, without bribery, and without a single man's help. The story spread fast, of course. But rather than punish Winifred, the government decided to look the other way. Perhaps they admired her nerve. Perhaps they didn't want the PR nightmare of executing a woman who just outsmarted them with nothing more than a change of clothes. She fled to Rome to join her husband, where they lived out their days in quiet exile. No crowns, no titles, no estates, but also no scaffold. And that, in the grim arithmetic of treason, counted as a win. Winifred's story stands out because it's so rare. Most wives didn't have the chance, or the audacity, to fight back. But her calm defiance sits in stark contrast to another woman from 2 centuries earlier, whose life was the exact opposite of escape. Where Winifred slipped through the cracks, Margaret Pole was crushed by the system itself. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, let's drift back to Tudor England again. Yes, Henry VIII is still there, stomping. Through history like an overfed thundercloud, Margaret Pole was one of the last surviving members of the Plantagenet line, that unlucky royal family Henry's ancestors had replaced. She was the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, the same Clarence who was supposedly drowned in a butt of wine, which, if true, makes her the closest thing to a medieval cautionary tale about over-drinking. By birth, she was noble. By marriage, loyal. And by temperament, careful. Her husband, Sir Richard Pole, had been a solid, unremarkable man, loyal to the Tudors, which was an achievement in itself. But after his death, Margaret quietly maintained her dignity, raised her children, and managed her estates. She even served as governess to Princess Mary, Henry VIII's daughter with Catherine of Aragon. So you'd think that loyalty would have earned her safety. But Henry, as we know, had a flexible relationship with gratitude. When Henry divorced Catherine to marry Anne Boleyn, Margaret made the mistake of staying loyal to Catherine. She didn't rebel, or plot, or scheme. She just refused to flatter Anne. And in Tudor politics, silence was often louder than treason. Things escalated when one of her sons, Reginald Pole, became a cardinal and publicly criticized Henry's new marriage. Henry took that personally. He couldn't get to Reginald, safely tucked away in Italy, so he went after his family instead. Her other sons were arrested and accused of conspiracy. One was executed. Her estates were confiscated. And Margaret, this 70-year-old widow who had spent her life staying out of trouble, was thrown into the Tower of London. She spent over 2 years there. No trial, no confession, just the slow erosion of royal patience. And then, one morning in 1541, Henry decided he'd waited long enough. She was led out to the execution block. But there was a problem. She hadn't been formally condemned, and the executioner wasn't exactly prepared. According to reports, the whole thing was botched. Slow, messy, and merciless. A quiet old woman, killed not for what she'd done, but for what her blood represented. If Lady Nithsdale's story is about courage and cunning, Margaret Pole's is about how impossible it could be to survive royal paranoia. She didn't resist. She didn't plot. She simply existed in the wrong family tree. And in a monarchy obsessed with bloodlines, that was enough to make her dangerous. Margaret's death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It sent a clear message. In the Tudor world, treason wasn't a single act. It was hereditary. If your father rebelled, you could be punished decades later. If your son angered the king, you might pay for it. If your cousin was executed, you'd better start praying. The entire system ran on guilt by association, which made marriage, especially to a powerful man, less of a partnership and more of a long-term gamble. If he rose in favor, you rose with him. If he fell, you'd better start packing for the tower. Let's step out of the executions for a moment. Not literally, of course, and talk about how these women lived after treason, or rather, how they were expected to live. The crown had a few standard scripts for traitors' widows. If she was young and attractive, meaning useful, she might be remarried to a loyal nobleman, effectively recycling her back into the political machine. If she was old or politically tainted, she'd be sent to a convent or placed under house arrest. But if she was clever, like Winifred Maxwell, she might find a way to turn loyalty into leverage. It's easy to forget how much of women's survival depended on perception. They couldn't hold office. They couldn't own confiscated lands in their own name. Their reputation was their currency. And once a husband was declared a traitor, that currency tanked overnight. Yet somehow, through all of that, some of them managed to maintain a sliver of power. They petitioned, they negotiated, they rebuilt. Margaret Douglas, another of Henry VIII's troublesome relatives, managed to survive multiple imprisonments because she played the long game, flattering when necessary, fading into the background when not. She was technically related to both Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth I, which sounds like an honor until you realize it was basically a constant invitation to house arrest. If you're noticing a pattern here, you're not wrong. The wives of traitors rarely got justice, but they almost always got remembered, quietly, as footnotes, as ghosts behind the politics. When we read royal histories, their names are often attached to men's tragedies. Wife of the executed, mother of the rebel, daughter of the condemned. But if you read between the lines, the letters, the property records, the fragments of gossip, you can see how they held everything together. They wrote the petitions. They raised the orphaned children. They kept the family name from vanishing entirely. They were, in a way, the silent archivists of disaster. So as we drift toward the end of tonight's part, think of the two women we've met, Lady Nithsdale and Margaret Pole. One slipped through the cracks of a crumbling system. The other was crushed beneath it. Both, in their own quiet ways, remind us that treason wasn't just about politics. It was about survival. And who got to define it? Next time, we'll wander through the later centuries, the Georgian, the Victorian, when treason faded as a legal sentence but lingered as a social stain. We'll meet the widows who became writers, reformers, and, occasionally, national embarrassments. But for now,
Just breathe.
the heads have stopped rolling, the petitions are gathering dust, and the tower gates are finally quiet. Let's leave them there, in the stillness, where the echoes of loyalty and loss are just background noise. Soft enough to fall asleep to. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still here, you've made it through the Tudors. Congratulations. That alone deserves a medal, or at least a quiet nap. Tonight, we're gliding gently forward in time, past the chopping blocks and poisoned cups, into an era where treason stopped being a guarantee of execution and started becoming something more subtle. By the 18th and 19th centuries, royal vengeance had gotten tired. The monarchs were still touchy about rebellion, of course. They always are. But society was evolving. Executions were messy, scandalous, and worst of all, unfashionable. So instead of sending men to the block, governments started perfecting a softer punishment: erasure. And their wives, as always, went down with them, only this time without the satisfying finality of a beheading. Let's drift into the world of powdered wigs, fainting couches, and quiet disgrace. The Georgian ghosts in the Georgian era. That is, roughly the 1700s through the early 1800s. Treason was still a legal crime, but it had started to lose its theatrical flair. Gone were the public disembowelments and quartered limbs. Instead, you might be hanged discreetly, or quietly exiled to the colonies, or simply disappeared from polite society. For a wife, that created a new kind of suffering, social invisibility. No one threw stones at you anymore. They just stopped inviting you to dinner. It sounds small, but in Georgian England, reputation was oxygen. Without it, you suffocated. Slowly, elegantly, and with perfect posture. Take Lady Sarah Lennox, for example. Now, she wasn't technically the wife of a traitor, but she was close enough to scandal that her life followed the same pattern. She was one of those dazzling women of her age, beautiful, witty, and unfortunately involved with the wrong people. Her cousin Charles Lennox flirted dangerously with Jacobite sympathies. Her own family's politics swayed with the wind, and when things turned sour, Sarah found herself out of favor with the court she'd once enchanted. She wasn't imprisoned. She wasn't executed. She was simply ignored, which, in Georgian society, was the social equivalent of being buried alive under tea and gossip. But perhaps the clearest echo of the old traitor's wife pattern comes from the wives of the 1745 Jacobite rebels. Yes, them again, because the Stuarts just wouldn't quit. When Bonnie Prince Charlie's rebellion failed, dozens of noblemen were executed or exiled. Their wives were left to pick up the pieces. And once again, it was the women who showed the real endurance. Lady Ogilvy disguised herself as a maid and escaped from prison. Lady Balmerino fought for years to recover her confiscated estates. Lady Nithsdale, of course, had already set the gold standard for jailbreak fashion. These women weren't warriors, but they mastered the art of bureaucratic survival. Letters, petitions, charm, and when all else failed, a strategic feint at the right moment. You see, by the 18th century, treason had become more of a paper crime. It lived in documents, oaths, and signatures. And women, barred from politics but fluent in manipulation, adapted to that world with quiet brilliance. They wrote endless letters to ministers, appealing to mercy in that elegant round-hand script that somehow made even begging look tasteful. They sent gifts, little reminders of loyalty wrapped in ribbon. They made friends with the wives of powerful men, who might, in turn, whisper a good word to their husbands at dinner. Sort of soft diplomacy, one tear at a time. But let's float a little farther into the 19th century, the age of the Victorians, when the word treason took on new shapes. No more medieval plots or royal coups. Now treason was ideological, revolutionary, political. And while the stakes were still deadly, the tone had changed. The scaffold was giving way to the courtroom, and the traitor's wife was now a political widow, sometimes shamed, sometimes celebrated. The Victorian revolutionaries. Let's take a quiet stroll through the mid-1800s. Europe was a simmering pot of revolutions. France, Italy, Hungary, Ireland. And everywhere, you could find women quietly orbiting the men who led them. Wives, lovers, sisters, all living in the long shadow of sedition. One of the more haunting examples comes from the Irish rebellions of the 19th century. The wives of Irish nationalists lived through decades of imprisonment, exile, and financial ruin. When the Young Ireland movement collapsed in 1848, or when the Fenian uprisings failed later on, It wasn't the men's speeches that kept the cause alive. It was the women's endurance. They turned their drawing rooms into fundraising hubs, their letters into propaganda, and their mourning into performance. They'd appear in public, draped in black, faces pale, eyes downcast, the picture of loyal suffering. Aesthetic grief, you could call it. Society loves a tragic woman after all, especially one who knows when to keep her voice low. In England, the tone was a little different. The monarchy was stable, the rebellion smaller, but scandal, as always, found a way. A particularly strange case unfolded in 1820 with the Cato Street conspiracy, a failed plot to assassinate the entire British cabinet. It was the last gasp of the old-style treason trials. The men involved were executed, of course, and their wives, working-class women mostly, were left destitute. No royal petitions, no pensions, no polite silence, just hunger. While the upper-class widows of history retreated to country estates, the working-class wives of Cato Street vanished into London's slums, forgotten even by the newspapers that had once printed their husbands' names in bold. They were traitors' widows without titles, which meant without history. The French ghosts of treason. Now, if we drift over to France, again, because France never really stops having revolutions, we find a familiar melancholy. By the 19th century, French politics was basically a revolving door of republics, empires, and coups. And every new regime came with its own round of traitors. One generation's rebel was the next generation's hero, which meant their wives had to keep reinventing themselves every few years. From Madame the Patriot's widow to Madame the enemy's widow to Madame who now runs a boarding school. The shifting labels didn't just ruin reputations, they created a kind of permanent, emotional limbo. Imagine trying to mourn a husband while newspapers debated whether he was a martyr or a monster. You couldn't even grieve properly. It was all political theater. Let's pause for a second and notice something. Over time, the violence in these stories faded, but the loneliness didn't. In every century, the wives of condemned men faced the same slow unraveling. Loss of money, loss of friends, loss of identity. They weren't executed anymore, but they were still erased. In the Middle Ages, a widow might end up in a convent. In the Georgian era, she'd vanish behind the curtains of her manor house. In the Victorian age, she'd appear at charity events, smiling, polite, quietly exiled in plain sight. Different centuries. Same silence. The last treasons by the late 1800s. Formal treason trials were rare in Western Europe, but the archetype of the traitor's wife lingered, like a ghost of an older, crueler time. And then came the 20th century, with new wars, new ideologies, and new kinds of betrayal. Suddenly, treason wasn't about kings and crowns anymore. It was about nations, espionage, secret letters, radio codes, quiet betrayals over cups of coffee. And yet, even in that modern world, the old pattern stayed. When men were caught spying, collaborating, or defecting, their wives became social casualties. Not imprisoned, just untouchable. A traitor's widow in the 1940s might not lose her home, but she'd lose her neighbors. No one wanted to sit beside her at church. Her children changed schools. Her mail arrived late or not at all. The executioner had retired, but the gossip hadn't. It's strange, isn't it? How history keeps the structure of punishment, even when it forgets the reason. Treason stops being a legal crime, but the social penalty, the isolation, stays the same. You can change the century, the weapon, the ideology, but you can't quite shake that old reflex. The suspicion that guilt spreads by association. And that's what these stories, from Margaret Pole to Lady Nithsdale to the nameless wives of conspirators, all share. They remind us that history has a long memory for shame, especially borrowed shame, the quiet inheritance. So, what became of the lineages of these women? Most faded. Their children changed names, reinvented themselves, married safely. Occasionally, though, the descendants of traitors resurfaced. In Parliament, in the army, even in the peerage, the family curse finally diluted enough for polite society to forget. But behind those polished genealogies, there's almost always a woman who held the ruins together long enough for the next generation to rebuild. The wife who wrote the petitions, who pawned her jewelry, who kept the family Bible when everything else was confiscated. The history books record the executions, but they forget the housekeeping that followed. Let's float toward the end now gently. We've traveled from the cold stone of the Tower of London to the salons of the Victorians, and finally to the quiet exile of the 20th century. And through all of it, one pattern repeats: the men made the treason. The women lived the punishment, not dramatic, not glamorous, Just slow, unending endurance. When you think of history's grand betrayals, the rebels, the regicides, the conspirators, try to picture the silence that followed. Somewhere, in a half-empty room, there was always a woman folding her husband's coat, writing a letter that would never be answered, and wondering what, exactly, she was supposed to be loyal to now. And that, I think, is the softest part of Treason's echo. The part that doesn't make it into the textbooks, because it's too quiet to notice, but still lingers centuries later, like dust in the rafters of old houses. Next time, if you're still awake, we'll drift into another kind of history. The lives of royal children who never stood a chance, the sad, sickly, and spoiled heirs of Europe's dynasties. But for now, just breathe. The rebellions are over, the widows are resting, and the past, as usual, is asleep.